Today, I want to show you my 3 favorite Japanese handsaw tricks. As some of you may know, I am brand ambassador for Suizan saws, and what comes as a really cool perk for that is I can now offer my favorite Suizan saws in the Katz-Moses store at a discounted rate for you. And in fact, they are on pre-sale now. There's a link in the pinned comment and the description. Now, as all of you have seen, I use my Suizan folding dozuki and folding ryoba for just about everything. And I wanted to show you some tricks with these that seem really intuitive but really help kind of the minutia of woodworking and solve some of the problems you may have in your day-to-day handsaw work. So let's come into the bench and let me show you number 1. Now, number 1 is a depth guide, and I'm going to show you how this works with a really cool acrylic see-through guide. So you'll actually be able to see me sawing, but you can see at the tip of each one of these saws, this is the small dozuki, and these are all the ones that are in my store, the small ryoba, the small flush cut saw that does both hard and soft wood, the folding dozuki and the folding ryoba. They all have this final tooth here at the end that is very big and is used as a depth guide. Now let me show you how that works. Okay, so when you look at the end of a Japanese saw, all of them have this flat part here, and the end of that tooth is exactly even with the length of the first cutting tooth in your saw, like this, in this direction. And then of course the teeth are in a straight line. So when you tip that up, that becomes a depth guide. And let me show you. So when you're cutting wood, you tend to cut down to your line here and down to your line here. Let's say that our line is right there, that's our depth line, and we end up cutting like this. And then with the depth guide here, when you tilt the saw up and it rests on this tooth, which is a non-cutting tooth, you can then use it to just go right along your line, and it's going to trim out the fibers in the middle and leave you perfectly at your depth. So let's look at that here. We'll do a real close-up here through some acrylic, and you can see it actually in action. So when you're cutting, and you can see our depth line there, when you're cutting, what you have a tendency to do, especially with dovetails, is you cut down to the front of your line, and I'm exaggerating this a little bit, and then you will look over your board and you'll cut down to your depth line there, and you can see that there's a hump in the middle. And here, I'll change the acrylic here so that we get a nice clear look at this. Actually, fun fact, these were a Dowel Jig Prototype. We were trying to figure out what material to make them out of. So you can see perfectly, that is very typical of a dovetail cut because you're so worried about the back of your line and the front of your line here that a lot of times you leave a hump in the middle and then you have to clear it out later with a chisel. But here is just the easiest way in the world to do this. So when you take the front of your saw, normally you would be cutting like this. You're going to tilt it up so that it's perfectly sitting flat on that there. And then what will happen when you start to cut away at that bump, this little tip of your saw is going to catch at the lowest part of your line and keep you from going any further. You can see that it just perfectly takes it down to that line. All right, let's talk about number 2. Trick number 2 is how to saw squarely. And I have a whole video on how to saw correctly, but this is just a trick you have to know, so it bears repeating. And I'll link that video right here in the corner. But when you're rip cutting, and on a ryoba saw, these are for cross cutting, these smaller teeth, to sever the fibers of the board. And these are for rip cutting because it's much easier because you're going with the grain. And here's a little tip within a tip, which is start with your crosscut side just to get the line going and then switch over to your rip teeth. Tends to work a lot better. But the real trick here is to look at the saw's reflection. So when you look at your board in the saw, you can see that when I move my saw, the reflection of the board starts to move. And so you want that board to look like the full board in the reflection. So you don't want those lines to be crooked. So I check the reflection of my saw and make sure that the board is in a straight line when I'm cutting. So I'll start it with my crosscut teeth here. And then flip over to my rip side. And then I'm just going to watch the reflection of the board, and look, you can see when I angle too far this way, the reflection changes as well. So you want it to just look like a real board without any distortion up or down or left or right, and that's how you know you're cutting perfectly square. Whoops. And then once it gets down a little bit, you're not going to have a problem because it's going to stay square. And if you look at that cut, without even trying that hard, we've got a square cut. All right, let's talk about number 3. All right, trick number 3 is kind of the opposite of trick number 1, and it's about using the first tooth on the saw. So we have our knife line, and you've watched my how to saw correctly video, so we're gonna make a little knife wall. But that knife wall is gonna be a little bit angled and a little bit difficult to get your saw to sit this way correctly. So you can use this last tooth the same way we did the other one, and just drag it across, and it's gonna clean out any of the chisel waste that you couldn't remove with your chisel, and it's gonna create a perfect knife wall. And so that way, when you start cutting, and of course it's on both sides of the saw, so it's just real easy to just clean out the waste. Sort of like making your marking gauge line just a little bit deeper, but it squares up that little crevasse there. Crevasse, I'm so fancy. And then you can just start getting a perfectly straight cut. Then you start angling your saw, just like that. So that's trick number 3, guys. Remember to go down and check out that pre-sale. I have 5 saws, the 2 folding Ryoba and Dozuki, which the Dozuki is the one for dovetails. And then I also have the smaller versions of those same 2 saws, which are very economical. The flush cut saw, which does hard and soft wood, they just released this, is very, very good. And if you pair that with some of my other products like a dovetail jig or a stop block, there's gonna be massive discounts. So go check out that pre-sale down below. They're all gonna ship out next week before Thanksgiving. So thanks for watching, guys. Stay safe in the shop and have a wonderful day.